Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to the All Me podcast. My name is Tavis Piatoli, sports dietitian for the Taylor Hooten Foundation, and today I'm going to be your host. When you think of the word fatigue, you may associate this with just being tired. Fatigue is more than just being tired or sleepy, as many people who have fatigue are so drained that their exhaustion interrupts daily life. Nearly 44% of employees have reported physical fatigue at work, which is up 38% from 2019. It was also reported that 60% of those same employees reported negative impacts of work-related stress, interest, motivation, or energy, which resulted in a lack of effort. In this podcast, we speak with Dr. Ali Boolani to discuss what is physical and mental fatigue, the causes, the signs and symptoms, how diet, exercise, and sleep play a big role, and what can we do to minimize both. Ali is currently an associate principal scientist at the Gatorade Sports Sciences Institute and a research professor at Clarkson University. Ali received his bachelor's and master's at Tulane University in international relations, with a focus in international political economics. He then went on to receive a master's of education at the University of New Orleans and a PhD at Oklahoma State University in applied physiology. After his PhD, he pursued a postdoc fellowship at the University of Georgia under the direction of Dr. Patrick O'Connor in mental energy and fatigue. He is currently pursuing a master's in theoretical artificial intelligence at Johns Hopkins University. Prior to moving to GSSI, Ali was a tenured associate professor of Clarkson University, where he led a team of interdisciplinary researchers who were interested in better understanding inter- and intra-individual differences in objective and subjective feelings of energy and fatigue. He has published more than 60 peer-reviewed articles, secured more than 20 federal, state, and industry grants, presented over 125 peer-reviewed research abstracts, and has been an invited speaker at more than 20 national and international conferences. We'd also like to thank our partners at Gatorade for sponsoring this podcast. Dr. Boolani, thank you so much for joining us today on the All Me podcast. It's great to have you.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to it, Tavis.
So I know we've had a relationship in the fact that we've known each other a really long time. And prior to Hurricane Katrina, you were in New Orleans. I worked in New Orleans, and when I saw your name come up, and I was like, no way, Ollie's with Gatorade. So it's really good to catch up and great to have you here and talk about, because I remember back then, you were like, I'm going to pursue my PhD, and I have all these ideas. I was like, this guy's just really, really smart. And here you are. We reconnect, 10, 15 years later, and we're doing a podcast together.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of exciting. It was great to see your name pop up and go, wow, I've known this person for a long time, over 20 years now.
Yeah. And today's topic, we're talking about the role of fatigue on mental and physical health, right? Those are big words. But before we dive into your expertise and the research you've done in this area, let's talk a little bit about your career path. As you've moved from the fitness world, right, into a position as a scientist. So tell us a little bit about just all of that and how you got into where you were and to where you are now.
So I actually didn't set out to be a scientist. I really just set out. I watched way too many Bond movies. And so I wanted to be a super spy. That's really what my passion was in life. I went to Tulane for my undergrad and my first master's. It was in international political economics. What I really wanted to do was, use that background to go be a spy somewhere. I joined the Marine Corps. I did all the things that I thought I needed to do to be a spy. Well, that worked out so well that I'm here. But, one of the things was I was a low-income kid, first gen. So I had to do something to support myself through school. And what I ended up doing was I ended up working as a personal trainer and an EMT. And the reason why I did that is because I really loved fitness and sports, and it paid so much better than any other job I could get. And then that was when I started that, I was like, oh, I'm an idiot. I don't know so many things. And so I would just learn more, read more, and just wanted to learn more and not be, I wanted to be someone who was well versed in exercise and exercise science. And so I ended up actually leaving my career as wanting to be a super spy. And actually, I worked for a finance company in New Orleans for a while and just said, nope, this is not it for me. And pursued a master's at University of New Orleans under Dr. Contos. Anthony Contos was I don't know if you remember him, but he was my mentor there. And I remember one of his classes, he made us do human subjects work. And one of the reasons why I pursued my first master's is because I was really curious about what caused humans to make decisions. And Dr. Contos showed me that there's a world out there where you can test human beings and you can actually see what's going on with people. And so, yeah, I pursued that and realized I really like figuring out what's going on with people. And that just led me down this path where I continued on past my master's, went and did a PhD, a postdoc, another fellowship, and then another master's. And now here I am at Gatorade.
Well, it's funny because, with all that work you've done, you probably have a little bit of fatigue. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about fatigue. So we know it's a pretty big word, right? Fatigue is a big word. And you just say that. It's like recovery. It's like, we're going to talk about this in a few parts. So first of all, my first question for you today is, can you give our readers a little overview of just what physical fatigue is and how would you define that?
So that's, I'm really glad this is the podcast that I was on because I think most people, when they think of fatigue, and by the way, just so you know, until about 2018, even ICD-10 said fatigue was the absence of energy. But primarily based on my work and also the work of my postdoc mentor, Pat O'Connor, what we find is that energy and fatigue are actually two distinct unipolar moods. So instead of describing energy and fatigue as like the opposite sides of the same coin, the way I would describe it is that they're two distinct coins, right? So you can be high energy and high fatigue simultaneously, or low energy and low fatigue simultaneously as well. And the way I would define physical fatigue would be more based on like some of the work that the psychologists end of things have done, which is, energy is the person's ability to perform physical activity, while fatigue is your perception of reduced physical capacity or persistent sense of like physical tiredness or exhaustion. So I think the best way to illustrate it is people, when they have a decline in energy or physical energy, they end up keeping the speed of their task about the same, but they make more errors. And what we saw, one of the classic examples of this was a study that we did where what we found was that when people became less energetic, they made more errors when they were walking, but didn't change how fast they were walking. Whereas fatigue, on the other hand, we didn't see a change in errors, but people started walking slower. So what this suggests is that they perceive their ability to walk decline, which is why they start to slow down. So that's why, deconstructing energy and fatigue as two distinct moods is very important, because it could help us understand errors versus slowing down.
That's interesting. Yeah. That's I'm sure there's a lot of different, when you look at just athletes in general, right? It's fatigue's going to cause a lot of, when you say errors when walking, I'm sure it's errors in baseball, mistakes in football, mistakes in, looking at the Super Bowl and things that happened last night. I'm sure a lot of fatigue had a lot to do with certain decisions on certain times of what happens, or at least on the outcome of that performance. That's interesting. Now, when you look at primary causes, I'm sure there's a couple of different things. What are some of the primary causes of things like physical fatigue?
So once again, because of the fact that it's so complex, right, with energy and fatigue being distinct, the causes are also very distinct and different. So the way I would describe it is that feelings of energy have peaks and valleys. And what happens is that there's a fluctuation, while fatigue is something which there's more of like a steady decline. And so, the way I would look at it is there are some reasons for low energy or high fatigue. It all depends on the person. So I wouldn't really say that it happens to everyone, but it's more person dependent. Is sleep, sleeping poorly, whether it's getting less sleep or having more sleep disturbances. Another one is diet. Diet plays a big role in your feelings of physical energy and fatigue. You've also got influences such as, for example, exercise. One of the really interesting studies that we published recently was that individuals who didn't like being around people felt more physically fatigued after a group exercise session, but saw an increase in feelings of physical energy. So it's very distinct and it's person dependent.
Interesting. All right. So yeah, it's too many factors, as you mentioned.
Yes.
Like, not just one particular cause. You mentioned sleep. Are there any, and again, this may be another broad question, but any outside of sleep, common side effects of physical fatigue? Anything that someone could look out for outside of maybe just saying, I feel tired? Anything else that we can look at?
Yeah. So, the biomarkers are also very distinct. So, for example, resting metabolic rate. We see decreased resting metabolic rate with increased feelings of fatigue. We also see decreased peripheral mitochondrial function with decreased feelings of energy, physical energy, sorry. Then, some of the other things that we're also seeing is changes in immunological markers. So what you end up seeing is with increase in physical fatigue, you actually end up seeing an increase in pro-inflammatory biomarkers. And then with declines in feelings of energy, you see a decline in anti-inflammatory biomarkers. So long story short, there's increased inflammation.
So for the general layperson listening right now, what are some of those biomarkers? If they're like constantly tired and say, I want to go to the doctor, what are some things that they would ask their doctor to maybe measure?
So there are tons of distinct biomarkers, but the ones that we primarily study, that are easier to identify would be like TNF alpha. You start talking about the different interleukins and how those are impacted. So, for example, physical fatigue will increase TNF alpha, whereas declines in energy will decrease annexin A1. So, those are some of the physiological markers that, you could go have them check it out and see what's going on with and some of the inflammatory biomarkers. You've also got serotonin, dopamine. So serotonin levels will go down with fatigue, whereas dopamine levels will go down as feelings of energy decline. There will be a decline in dopamine levels as feelings of fatigue increase. You'll have an increase, or you'll have a decrease in serotonin levels.
So you mentioned a little bit about diet earlier. I heard you say something, food, obviously things we eat can impact. How does diet, impact physical fatigue? Are there any specific type of guidelines that can help reduce someone's maybe time to fatigue or just the onset of fatigue?
So that's something that we're still working on. We still are trying to understand these inter-individual differences. One of the problems that ends up happening in this world is that there are distinct individual differences. So, for example, you might respond better to caffeine, whereas I might respond more negatively to caffeine. I've got a study where we actually looked at caffeine, and what we found was that there was, based on your personality traits, you were responding very uniquely to caffeine. Some people were actually performing better. Some people were performing worse. So in that sense, it's very difficult to do that. But, some of the things that have been fairly consistent have been diets that are rich in polyphenols, fibers, omega-3 fatty acids. But once again, those results are conflicting, and a lot of it has to do with our inter-individual differences. And as you know, with the gut microbiome, with the epigenome, and the role that those play.
Yeah, it's so complicated. There's not like one answer. Hey, just eat more carbs and you'll have more energy. Or if you eat too many, you might have a little bit of fatigue, right? From too much maybe serotonin or tryptophan production.
Yes.
Now, Gatorade's a hydration company. I've heard where, hey, the first sign of fatigue could be due to dehydration. Is that true? And if not, how does hydration play a role in this?
Hydration is not my scope of expertise. So I recently left academia to come to GSSI. So I'm still getting a handle on dehydration. This is the work of my colleagues that do this. But, basically what happens with dehydration is that there's significant changes in performance markers. And most lay people will identify that as fatigue. So, for example, what we see changes in strength. We see changes in anaerobic power. We actually see an increase in ratings of perceived exertion. So, for example, if you are exercising and you're like, this is like a 12, right? But your intensity stays the same, or you're exercising at that same intensity, but you're dehydrated. Now that perceived exertion is significantly higher. So, those are ways that we actually see that quote unquote increase in fatigue and physical fatigue. But I think we've got to be careful when we are trying to really decipher that, because, is a decline in strength an increase in fatigue, or a decline in anaerobic performance a sign of fatigue? We are still, trying to figure that out. So I would say that there is a decline in performance and physical performance, and your perception of that performance is also, you feel like you're doing something much harder.
Yeah, and just maybe training in Louisiana in August, it's going to instantly cause a little bit of fatigue just because of that heat and humidity.
Yes, I agree. I do remember those days and don't miss them.
Yeah. So let's kind of shift a little bit to exercise a little bit. As we shift to exercise and training programs, someone can be training too much. I've seen this before where it's like, wow, looking at somebody, whether it's a young athlete, whether it's an adult, can overtraining or just doing too much activity lead to physical fatigue?
So this, once again, is not my scope of expertise, but I am glad that I kind of came out of the Bill Morgan tree. Bill Morgan is formerly of the University of Wisconsin, and he is the world-renowned expert on overtraining. And then Dr. Jack Ragland, who's at University of Indiana, is also very well known for this overtraining work. And I don't know if I'll do their work justice, but I'll try my best. One of the things that ends up happening with overtraining is that you'll actually see increases in mood disturbances. And the reason why I say mood disturbances is that it's very person dependent. So some people who overtrain will actually see increases in anxiety, while others will report increases in depression, while others might report increases in both moods. Or something else that we're also seeing is that some people who overtrain also report being angrier. So those are like the mood disturbances. There's also sleep disturbances, which you see changes in sleep patterns. And once again, it's person dependent. Some people sleep more, some people sleep less. You'll see a decrease in your exercise performance. So your actual physical performance, you'll see a decrease in it. You'll also see, if you're looking at blood biomarkers, you'll see decreases in testosterone, increases in cortisol levels, increases in urinary catecholamines, acetylcholine, serum prolactin, growth hormone. What you'll see is that the hormonal responses to exercise end up being blunted when you're overtrained. And then you also see decreases in like VO2 max, decreases in RMR. You'll see abnormal metabolic responses. You'll see increases in inflammatory biomarkers, decreases in anti-inflammatory biomarkers. And some people also see a decrease in muscle mass and an increase in body fat. So those are all some good physiological markers, and something that Dr. Ragland has been working on, him and his colleagues have been doing, is a concept called staleness. And what you do is, you start to find that you just don't have the ability to train at the level that you used to be able to train. And so that staleness also occurs, and it's usually, according to them, one of the first signs of overtraining.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, there's a lot of signs and symptoms that could be the onset of not just fatigue, but a lot of, like, as you mentioned, overtraining. Right. Some of these athletes today are just individuals in general. I had a client recently that I was like, look, you got to scale back. It's, constantly trying to chase the scale, doing too much. But then I looked at her training program and I was like, oh, wow, you're doing 3 hours a day of lifting and conditioning as an adult. And thinking more is better. It's in constantly seeing her tired, sleep, a high heart rate, as you mentioned, different side effects that are impacting that. So thanks for sharing that information. Now, while it may not be your expertise, we get a lot of questions about just high school athletes in general. I've gotten a lot of questions. I see some of these kids today, they're trying to build muscle, but they're doing 5-6 hours of movement between lifting. Maybe it's a private personal trainer, their games, whether it's a sport, specialty coaches. Do you know this or not? But is there a ceiling on maybe how many hours someone's body or someone should train to maybe reduce chronic fatigue, or is that just independent on the individual?
It is person dependent, but I think some of the things that these individuals or these kids should think about is, things such as the load on the bones. So like mechanical fatigue, right? So although physiologically you might be able to handle it, but what about your bones? Can your bones, like, your cardiopulmonary system was able to handle it, but were your bones able to handle it? The psychological toll this is taking on them. Are they getting the same benefits? And something that I tell people is, using concepts from behavioral economics, which is the margin effect, right? So for example, if for every, and I'm just making up a number here, for every hour beyond 1 hour of training, you get a 1% improvement. Great. But that is going to go down as you get further up, right? But what if for every hour of sleep that you get instead gives you a 5% improvement? Or maybe watching game film gives you a 3% improvement, right? You've got to start thinking, what is the maximal for you? Like, what is it that's going to maximize your returns on your training? Is it going to be that extra hour of shooting drills or whatever drills you're doing, or that training? Or is that time better spent studying game film or sleeping? Sleeping's a huge part of performance, and not sleeping well can negatively impact performance.
Yeah. And like it'd be interesting to kind of measure some of that, like to know, hey, how did this directly impact? And I know some things can't be measured, right? Some things probably we can't directly say, oh, because I did this, I slept an extra hour, I was able to throw the ball an extra 5 yards further than what I did the day before. But that's interesting, an interesting correlation point there.
So actually, Travis, there's some good work on that.
Really?
There's some good work on sleep and performance. And, what they find is that people who do get within, and don't quote me on the numbers because this isn't my work, but, within a couple of hours of the normal sleep, they end up performing significantly better. So for example, if you're meant to get 8 hours, I'm just making up a number again. If you're meant to get 8 hours of sleep and you get 6 or less or 10 or more, you're going to perform significantly worse than if you were at your optimal 8-hour sleep performance.
Yeah, I can attest to that just from sitting behind a computer most of the day and, knowing if I don't sleep an optimal amount of time, my body, my brain, my mood is just a little bit different. Now I figured out these little massage guns are just life-saving when it comes to helping go back to sleep. Wake up in the middle of the night and then my mind's racing. I'm like, oh, let me use my massage gun on my feet, my back. And then instantly I can fall back asleep, where in the past, I wasn't able to do that. So in the next day, it's like, wow, I'm completely refreshed. It makes a big difference. I think sometimes we underestimate how powerful sleep can be just on overall health.
Oh, I completely agree. I think that's a very understudied phenomenon. We have a study where, people who slept poorly the night before did not get the energy enhancing or anti-fatiguing benefits of physical activity.
Interesting. Yeah, and it's probably time for us to come back on with another sleep expert. We did one early on in our podcast world when we first started, and now it's definitely a lot of science has changed. Now, when we look at kind of closing out on this topic on physical fatigue, you mentioned a little bit about some things earlier, nutrients like omega-3. Are there any that you're aware of, anything on the evidence side from dietary supplements that can help maybe reduce time to fatigue, whether that's from exercise or it's just improving how we feel? Anything in regards to, is there anything we can take that the research says, hey, this might help you improve outcomes?
So a lot of it is mixed. Right. You've got some good work on creatine, caffeine, coenzyme Q10, beetroot juice. But once again, the evidence is mixed, and a lot of it is dependent on the methodology. But, there's really good evidence on creatine, but there's also evidence on creatine that it doesn't work. Same thing with caffeine. So I think figuring out what it is that your needs are is more important than just saying, oh, this works. It might not work for you. And the way you are using it.
Right. Good points. All right, let's shift over a little bit to mental fatigue. We talked a little bit about physical fatigue. Now we're going to kind of shift over to the mental fatigue side. Let's define that first. Can you give our listeners a little bit about what is mental fatigue?
So the definitions that I gave for physical and mental energy, physical energy and physical fatigue, I would take that and flip that to the mental side, which is your ability, your capacity to perform a mental task would be mental energy, whereas mental fatigue is your perceived ability to carry it out. And this is same thing. We see this in individuals where you see a decline in mental energy. You start seeing more errors in the cognitive tasks that they perform, whereas when you see an increase in mental fatigue, you see no changes in error rates, but you actually have increased reaction times to those cognitive tasks. So it just takes you longer to do something. You just don't make as many errors, but with declines in energy, you start making more errors.
Is it the same when it comes to causes for physical and mental? Anything specific that you say, look, these are some direct causes of mental fatigue?
So mental fatigue, one of the biggest causes has been sleep. It's been lack of exercise, sedentary time. Really cool study. What we found was that people who sat more than 8 hours in a day, it took them a lot more physical activity to start feeling less mentally fatigued than those who didn't sit 8 hours a day. And then some of the other things that we found is that people who do a ton of mental work on weekdays, we looked at work days and school days. So people who do a ton of mental work on those days, but then don't do as much on non-work days. So instead of spreading out your mental work over the course of the week, you just do everything in say 5 days. And then for the next 2 days, you do nothing, actually end up being more mentally fatigued than those who, kind of spread that out. And part of it might have to do with the fact that people who do spread it out tend to like their work more or tend to like school more, whatever it is. And so that's why they report feeling more energetic and less mentally fatigued. And one of the things that I think a lot of people don't think about is dehydration. Dehydration plays a role in mental fatigue. And there's significant work out there that what it does is it actually changes how we recruit our brains to perform cognitive tasks, and dehydration will actually increase our perceptions of how much effort it's taking to do the mental work, and it can actually slow it down.
That is interesting. Yeah, it's interesting how just certain things like diet, as you mentioned, sleep is another big factor. And I felt like you were talking to me. I'm like, okay, I sit a lot, unfortunately, for work. I tried to get a treadmill desk. The treadmill was too small. I was leaning over. I was like, I'm going to have awful posture trying to type, walking on this thing, trying to find ways to just be more physically active during the 8 hour, or even sometimes longer than that. But yeah, it's we see a lot more people sitting, a lot more people working from home or just working away from the office, which causes a lot of that, which is interesting.
Yeah, and that's something we were definitely shocked to see those results. And we weren't the only people. Like, there was another study that was done by someone else who was in my postdoc mentor's lab, where they found the exact same thing, where the people who were sitting for more than 8 hours a day were the ones who just weren't getting the benefits of their exercise intervention to feel less mentally fatigued or more mentally energetic. They were not getting that.
Yeah, I find if I work out in the morning, like first thing before I start my day, even though I'm going to be sitting, my energy levels are it's night and day. It's completely different. So it's amazing also the power of exercise and how that has on our brain. I know there's been a lot of studies on just exercise and brain health, and we're not going to dive too much into that today. But I do want to kind of focus a little bit on just, are there any steps that we can take? You've mentioned sleep, you've mentioned hydration, when it comes to maybe preventing or just reducing the onset of mental fatigue. Anything that you say, these things, if we maybe do one or two of these things every day, we could maybe reduce that onset.
Reduce sleep better, reduce sedentary time, exercise, and reducing sedentary time. And Travis, I know you didn't like the treadmill desk, but maybe even, just standing up and walking around 5 minutes every hour, or you could use a standing desk. One of the other things is maybe performing some work on non-work days or non-school days, right? Just especially for young kids. It's, even if you do a little bit, that will actually keep you mentally engaged and it'll reduce mental fatigue And one of the very interesting things that I wanted to bring up was we did a protocol where we had people do 3 hours straight of mental work where they were doing arithmetic, looking at, they were trying to identify numbers, whole nine, just mental work. And then we made them walk for 6 minutes. They felt so much better than when they even first came into the lab. So that should tell you the power of physical activity.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, and then, the other big thing is sleep. And then also there's very good evidence on polyphenol consumption and mental energy and mental fatigue.
So I saw a study recently just on the power of short bursts, like 1 or 2 minute short burst of activity every day. I don't remember the specific outcome on reduction in mortality, but it was quite significant, like 40 or 50% reduction in mortality just by doing something intense for 1 minute a day. And I was like, wow. I think the end of the outcome was like, look, 7 minutes a week of intense activity can really improve significant outcomes on health and mortality. I was like, all right, everybody has a minute or two to do something. You mentioned go walk for 6 minutes, right? Or just go walk for anything. I think a lot of times people feel like they have to do an hour or an hour and a half of intense exercise to get the health benefit. It really doesn't have to be that long.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in our lab, we haven't seen anything below 6 minutes that's worked. And we've tried 2 minutes, 4 minutes, and then 6 minutes is where we get the mood benefits. And so my work has primarily been focused on, anti-fatiguing, increasing energy of, with exercise. And what we find is that 6 minute marker, maybe we'll try 5, but really like below 6 minutes, at 4 and 2, it's difficult. But when you start getting to 6, even, it doesn't have to be super intense. It can simply just be, I'm walking around. And what we did was we actually told them walk around at whatever pace you feel most comfortable.
Yeah. Well, and, what's really interesting too is when we look at, the benefits of exercise, we're not talking weight loss, right? I think most people look at exercise and go, I need to do this to lose weight. Sure. Obviously, with weight loss, doing something for a minute or 2 or 6 or 10 minutes is probably not going to burn a lot of calories, but we're talking really just brain health, mental performance, as you've mentioned.
Yes. I mean, that's a huge part of it. Just doing that little bit can actually, it'll increase cerebral blood flow. It'll make you feel better. And to me, at the end of the day, it's about how do I feel right now? And just 6 minutes, just walk around, whatever pace you're comfortable with, and it'll make you feel better.
I feel like we're watching the movie Something About Mary when he goes 6 minute abs. It's like 6 minutes of exercise.
Well, I wouldn't say it's a hard and fast, but that is right now, that has been the lowest number that we've had success with.
Nice. Now, we talked about diet a little bit, from the physical side. Is there anything, where does nutrition play a role on the mental performance side? Are there any recommendations there on maybe foods that help with mental performance or just diet in general?
So, I mean, there's been significant evidence on caffeine and mental performance. There's been some on creatine, but there's also stuff on breakfast consumption. There's been some good work on breakfast consumption, improving mental performance. And there's also been things on cocoa and mental performance. And what you find is that cocoa ends up improving mental performance.
Nice. Yeah, I've seen some of that work on the cocoa side. So obviously the cocoa and the polyphenols, it seems to be a pretty powerful outcome there.
Yes.
Now, we've talked about exercise and, how that has a positive effect on brain health and mental performance. Is there anything specific that you're aware of on how does it directly impact mental performance? Is it, hormones? Is it dopamine? Is it endorphins? Where does exercise impact, the mental performance side of things?
So the evidence is sort of all over the place. You've got studies that have looked at dopamine levels and that have found that, that exercise increases dopamine levels, which we know that dopamine makes you feel more energetic, reduce feelings of depression and such. So there's definitely that neurohormonal component of it. And another component of it is increase in cerebral blood flow. So increase in cerebral blood flow actually makes you feel more motivated. It makes you feel slightly more mentally energetic. So And then you've got, later on, depending on how much you're doing, you'll actually see increases in serotonin, which, as you know, antidepressant, in terms of making you feel less depressed. We shouldn't say antidepressant, but makes you feel less depressed. And then it also makes you feel less fatigued.
Interesting. Now, when we look at, I'm going to go back to the high school athlete, because when we look at high school students in general, they're in class all day. They're learning. My daughter's 11. She's like, Dad, I'm tired, but we have a volleyball game tonight. And then they have to perform at practice. And we know this can be pretty stressful on someone, that's pretty young, but can having a challenging school workload impact their performance on the field? Have you seen any research around that, or just in general, based on what you know?
So I'll say this with caveats. There has been work done that shows that inducing mental fatigue decreases performance in sports. However, let me caveat that. The work that they make them do during that to induce mental fatigue is things that they don't normally do. So, for example, they make them subtract the number 7 repeatedly for 2 minutes, or they'll make them identify a number. I don't know about you, but I don't do that every day in my work. I never did that in school either. There are some studies that have them scrolling through cell phones to do it, but that work, same thing. They make them do things that they don't normally do. So that's the caveat that I want to make sure that I give, where yes, mental fatigue does increase decrease sports performance, but the tasks that these people do are usually not tasks that they normally do. However, there is a 60,000 person plus meta-analysis that found that if you find meaning in your work, in your mental work, you'll actually end up feeling more mentally energetic and less mentally fatigued if you find meaning in that work. So maybe if a kid does love school and loves, let's just say they had and I don't know about you, but I was the person who loved my math teacher, and I also really loved my world history teacher. So and then the classes too, I really loved those classes. I would walk out of those classes feeling super energized and ready to go, but I found meaning in that. And so that plays a role in it. So if a kid loves a class and they have it right before sports, maybe they'll actually feel more energized. I don't know, but that's why I say it's caveated, where they're doing things that they wouldn't normally do, and some of them just might not like it.
I agree 100%. I mean, teachers can have a big influence, and just leaders in general, on your mood and how you feel, whether that's, I loved, jobs that I've had because of the people I work with and the people I work around. They make it fun. They make you enjoy the work. Some days it's not great, but other days it's like, I get to be around fun people that are having the same outcome. I see that with my child too. She has favorite teachers that motivate her, and she likes the way they teach, and others probably not as much, and probably makes that subject a little bit less enjoyable to get throughout the day. It makes it a long class. But what you're telling me is, yes, mental fatigue could have an impact on physical fatigue, especially if you're mentally drained, and then obviously you have to go perform at a high level maybe later that day.
Yep.
Okay. Right. So we see some athletes have mental performance coaches. Are you familiar with this and kind of what they do to help athletes maybe prepare for a game or match?
So mental performance coaches are very different from the work that I do. I am familiar with some of the things that they do. For example, they help you manage your arousal levels. You can't be too anxious. You also can't be on the opposite end of the spectrum and be too calm. They help you figure out how to stay focused, how to manage your stress during performance. But that's beyond what I do.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a whole nother area. We've talked to some specialists in the past that deal with athletes and anxiety, right? That's a whole different area, as you mentioned, because that could be a big outcome in how they perform based on their mood and how they feel.
Yes.
A couple more questions, Dr. Boolani. When we look at, I see a lot of promotions on supplements for focus and brain performance and mental health. Anything that you're aware of? You mentioned creatine. You've mentioned some things like beetroot, but anything specific that that has good evidence that might be able to improve those outcomes?
Primarily the work that's got good evidence is caffeine, tyrosine, and carbohydrates.
Okay.
But most of the evidence is just all over the place. And like the cocoa stuff is actually quite good, but one of the problems with cocoa is, there's a problem with how we measure mental performance, but the stuff with cocoa is primarily we see increases in cerebral blood flow, which each person, the way those actually manifest themselves are different for each person.
Now, I know I didn't throw this question into our mix before we met, but just something I want to kind of maybe ask is, do you see people do things that they might be doing for improving focus or energy or performance or physical, and they shouldn't be doing? Like anything that said, hey, this is what I see that's commonly promoted or common recommendations in the space, and I don't recommend doing that?
I think a lot of people will just take whatever supplement has the best advertisement rather than actually looking at what's the evidence behind it. Or, for example, have you looked at how these two combination of ingredients actually work together? Do they really enhance? So sure, there might be evidence on one ingredient and there's evidence on the other, but has anyone looked at the combination? And so that's something that I personally think, people should be a little more aware of those kind of things.
Yeah, you mentioned caffeine and tyrosine, and I'm like, wow, that's a common combination in a lot of pre-workouts, but so are maybe 5 to 10 other ingredients that might come in that product. So, it was interesting to hear that combination because those are very two common ingredients that we see in supplements today.
Yes. And we don't, I'm not aware, I can't say we don't know. I'm not aware of studies that have looked at the combinations. And there are very few studies that look at actual combinations.
Yeah. And it's tough when you have like a 5 or 6 or 10 ingredient product to know what's really having the outcome, right? What's the ingredient that's really having the primary result when it comes to saying, oh, that person had more focus and more energy. Well, if there's 10 ingredients in there, how do we know, what caused that?
Exactly. So we try to study one ingredient at a time.
Now, last question for you. Is there anything else you'd like our readers to know about this topic that we didn't cover today on both either the mental or physical performance side?
To me, I think the biggest thing is you should think about how does your body feel and listen to your body. It gives you the signals before physiologically you can get the signals. So think about that as you are working out or whatever, and also think about the margins and think about, does that extra bit help me anymore, or would I be better served doing something else to improve my performance?
Excellent. Is there anything else your lab's looking at in the near future? Any other, research outcomes, studies that you're looking to do, in the next couple of months?
So obviously with GSSI, we're in industry to where I can't really say what we're working on, but I can tell you there is some work coming out of my previous lab where we were detecting changes in feelings of mental and physical energy and fatigue. And, we've got some very good results from that. We'll be presenting some of that work at the American College of Sports Medicine in May.
Nice. Awesome. Well, Dr. Boolani, thank you so much for the time. Fantastic information, but you're not done yet because we're going to move over to our curveball round. This is where I'm going to ask you 3 questions that have nothing to do with today's topic. It's a lot of fun. The first question is always a staple. I have this in every single person, but I do have a unique question that I have for number 2 that based on something you told me you wanted to be, I added a little bit to that. So question number 1, or you ready for this?
Sure. I am ready. Bring it on.
All right. So I'm a music junkie. I ask every single person this. If you could be the lead singer of any band, whether it's today or in the past, who would that be?
Tavis, I know we've known each other for a while, but I tried my hand at trying to be an R&B singer in New Orleans.
What?
Yeah. So I used to go out to, as you know, Cats and clubs like that. And I would try to be an R&B singer. I just have zero musical talent, but I really wanted to be the next Usher that should date me. And I was not very good. So a lot of the guys, when I would go out to do this, the guys would probably just turn off my mic and just be like, no, just don't sing, lip sync the whole thing.
That is one stage I have not gotten on just because I was like, it's such a different demographic in regards to when I used to sing in an alternative band versus getting in front of cats, and it's like everyone's probably expecting something fun, and I'm probably not going to be seeing anything fun for them to dance to. So that's cool. That's really neat. All right. You mentioned you wanted to be a spy earlier. So I was like, okay, I can turn this into a question. If you could have one superpower as a spy, what would that be?
Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, the superpowers that I want are like superhero superpowers. I don't know what human superpower I'd want. I guess probably I'd like to not have a body made of glass where I get injured every other day. So that would be the superpower I'd want as a human, but lots of superpowers.
Yeah, I think as a spy, the movie Jumper comes to mind because he just jumps and he's like 1 minute he's in maybe Michigan and the next minute he's in Egypt. He's like, wow, he's just jumping from country to country. And I was like, that would be pretty cool. That if I just a snap of a finger, I don't have to pay for a plane ticket. I can just be in Italy or be in France or be wherever I want to be.
Oh yeah, I want teleportation so that I could travel the world and like see every country.
That would be fantastic. All right, last question for you. If you can go back in time and talk to young Ollie, what would you tell him?
Listen to people. The older I got, the more I realized I didn't know, but I knew everything at 16. So I would definitely tell a 16-year-old Ollie to eat a big piece of humble pie and, realize that other people have lots of good things to say. And when they say you're not good at something, you should probably listen.
That's a great point. Yeah, I've learned my parents were always right back then. It's just like I'm trying to educate my daughter about that and help her understand, look, you're not going to trust everything I say and probably believe everything I say, but hopefully you'll come back one day and understand why I'm doing the things or saying the things I say. So this was fantastic. Thank you so much for, number one, spending the time with us today to learn more, about the work you do. Number two, it's great catching up and good to see you and reconnect after all these years.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot for interviewing me, Travis.
Awesome. Have a great day.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.